Imagine you're walking in the city and a guy who looks a bit loony comes up to you holding a rock. Your first instinct is probably to, run away or at least be skeptical or be a bit scared of the situation. This man, however, walks up to you and goes, "The rock, it's not real. It isn't actually made of matter." At that point, you're probably assuming this guy is either insane, high, or both, and you would probably try and make a quick escape. But let me tell you, this guy that may or may not be on something illegal, or may not need to be sectioned, might actually be talking about a very radical yet very profound philosophical theory. This is called idealism, and it is most famously defended by the Irish philosopher George Berkeley. Or Berkeley. It's not Berkeley, it's Berkeley. Berkeley's central claim is not that the world is fake, rather what only exists is minds and ideas. He claims that there's no mind-independent, objective, material world out there, and instead everything exists in our mind. And this is corroborated and made coherent through God's mind, who is the ultimate mind, as Berkeley rather profoundly proclaims. So Berkeley, unlike our friend at the beginning, is not actually saying a rock doesn't exist. Rather, he's saying something much stranger. The rock exists, not as a material object, but it exists as something that is perceived. In this video, I will first give a historical account of Berkeley's life. That is so we can understand the philosopher we're dealing with and what might have shaped his ideas throughout his life into founding this radical philosophical theory. I will then evaluate Berkeley's arguments stemming from this work, which is on human knowledge, the principles of human knowledge, and Berkeley's three dialogues, which are arguably the most important part of his philosophy. I will then conclude that despite Berkeley's arguments being quite well motivated, I don't think they actually are intellectually substantiable, which will then lead me to providing my own alternative views on idealism. Because I think the position is strong, I just don't think it's as strong as it could be as presented by the historical Berkeley. I'm going to do this because I feel Berkeley's idealism can be grounded in something less metaphysically abstract or metaphysically strange than Berkeley's definition of God. A historical account of the life of George Berkeley. Berkeley was born in Kilkenny, in Ireland. This was on the 12th of March, 1685. Berkeley's father, William Berkeley, was likely born in England, which makes arguably Berkeley an Anglo-Irish philosopher, rather than simply just an Irish philosopher. His father was a well-respected farmer as well, a gentleman, some may say. The family had no great wealth, and Berkeley's father acted as a revenue collector. Berkeley's mother, rather fittingly, was the daughter of an Irish brewer in Dublin. This creates the idea that Berkeley didn't come from an intellectual family like the rest of his intellectual peers. Berkeley was the eldest of 6 brothers, of whom which many had university careers and were academics within themselves. So despite them not having an intellectual background, they were all intellectually successful. Berkeley's education started at Kilkenny College, proving that he was a local lad. He then went from there to study mathematics, languages, and philosophy at Trinity College. This is the one in Dublin, not the one in Cambridge or Oxford. We get to Oxford later. Berkeley graduated in 1704 at the young age of 19. He then became a teaching fellow of Trinity in 1707. This would have made him 22. 3 years later, he was then ordained into the Anglican Church. This is where he first became a priest. All of these happened before the age of 25. This proves that at an early age, Berkeley was an intellectual force to be reckoned with, which I believe would foreshadow the rest of his life. In the same year, 1710, Berkeley released his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, one of the most pivotal works of idealism at its time and still to this day. 3 years later, he released his 3 dialogues. Again, this shows that Berkeley formed his intellectual philosophy at a very early age, at the age of 28. This is, extremely strange because most philosophers find their ideas in their 40s, 50s, or even 60s if you can't. But yet, Berkeley was able to do this before the age of 30. This shows that he was a prodigy. However, Berkeley's philosophy was extremely controversial, and the intellectual powerhouses of Europe, and most importantly the UK, mocked it. Nevertheless, intellectuals such as Samuel Clarke and William Winston did acknowledge Berkeley's philosophy, calling him a genius for his time, yet they still insisted that his first principles remained false. However, both men held very controversial philosophical views for their era, so it kind of makes sense why they could appreciate Berkeley's philosophy and would praise it despite not agreeing with him. Now, not only was Berkeley one of the few Irish philosophers, he was also one of the first philosophers that travelled to America, or I suppose the colony that it was at the time under British rule. Berkeley's journey to America was motivated by founding a college. This college would have been in Bermuda. It was intended to educate the local colonists who lived there, but also to convert the Native Americans, which people at the time argued were uncivilized, to Christianity, thus civilizing, quote unquote, America. This shows that Berkeley's religiosity was intertwined with his intellectual pursuits, showing that he was a man of, first and foremost, religious faith, but also educational practice. Berkeley gained serious support in founding this college. Most notably, Parliament vowed to give him £20,000 in order to found it, which, at the top of my head, I'm not sure what that would be in today's money, but I will have it on the screen here. Wow. So, in 1728, Berkeley, along with his wife Anne Forster, sailed to America. However, Berkeley didn't actually end up going to Bermuda. Instead, he ended up in Newport, Rhode Island. He did this because he was waiting for the money from Parliament. During this time, Berkeley ended up settling on a farm. Here, he spent almost 3 years waiting for the government to supply him his money in order for him to found a college. Making sure not to be idle during this time, Berkeley continued his intellectual pursuits. Most notably, he preached, wrote, and mixed with intellectual colonists. Here, Berkeley wrote most of the Alcothron. This work defended Christianity against the free thinkers. This shows that even though Berkeley was unorthodox and radical, he was still grounded in very traditional theology. However, unfortunately for Berkeley, his £20,000 never arrived. This led to him abandoning the project and sailing back to England in 1731. This shows that even though Berkeley's vision was compromised through lack of funding, his steadfast intellectualism and the development of idealism continued. Once Berkeley returned to Britain, he did not abandon intellectual life. Instead, he published a book that he was writing during his time in America, showing that even though his vision failed, he was still intellectually successful and relevant. In 1734, Berkeley was officially named a bishop, one of the highest roles in Christianity. As a bishop, he became increasingly involved in public and political life as he became concerned with the growing poverty, disease, and a need for social improvement in Ireland. Therefore, you could argue in a way, in the later life of Berkeley, his principles shifted from that of abstract, serious philosophy to everyday practical philosophy. It went from what is the nature of knowledge, an epistemological venture, to, what does it take to live a good life? What is good? How do we be good and improve people's lives? A very interesting example, and actually quite humorous, is Berkeley's strange interest in tar water. This is because he believed it to be a serious medical remedy, something that could cure disease. Near the end of Berkeley's life, he moved to Oxford. This was partly because his son was studying at Christ Church, but also so he could be at the centre of British intellectual life. However, this living environment was short-lived, as Berkeley died on the 14th of January, 1753, at the old age of 67. Here, Berkeley was buried in Christ Church's cathedral, and I'm pretty sure you can go and see his tombstone to this day. Alright, time to actually get on to the real philosophy, what Berkeley actually argued. And I think it's quite useful to recognise, because obviously it's relevant, what Berkeley was actually going against. Now, if you look at the dialogues, you'll know that Berkeley's intellectual philosophy was actually a response to growing anti-realism skepticism, and even atheism. So, when Berkeley's writing his philosophy, it almost replies to Descartes and John Locke, because obviously they were skeptics and indirect realists. So indirect realism is the philosophical position in which we don't experience the world directly, but have sense data of the world which is then mediated. So for example, I have got this, my Samsung earbuds here. Now if we look at it, you might say, well, I've got direct experience of it. Whereas the indirect realists would say, we've got numerous arguments for this, time lag, stuff like that. But essentially they would say, I am receiving a sense datum of this object which is created by the mind-independent object, which is then making me experience sense data of the object, which is similar to what this object looks like. And there's a distinction between the two properties. You've got primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities consists of things which exist mind independently, such as size, shape, mass, etc., etc. These are the mathematically measurable physical qualities. The secondary qualities would be things such as colour, temperature, taste, and smell. These are things which can only be experienced if there is a subject present. However, Berkeley argues these things cannot be separated. This is because, in Berkeley's words, it's impossible to imagine a primary quality without its secondary quality. So I cannot imagine this, according to Berkeley, without it being white. I can't imagine something without colour and taste. But I'm not going to lick it. So if our secondary qualities cannot be separated from our primary qualities, Berkeley therefore argues that they must exist together. Therefore, primary qualities are also mind-dependent. Locke argues that, although you can't imagine them differently, the secondary qualities are actually caused by the primary qualities, in the actual object. Locke argues there's some type of power within them which can cause it. So the actual object itself, here, is causing the whiteness, the sense datum of the whiteness for a subject. And obviously to cause means to be different, and to be different means to be separate. So therefore, according to Locke, PQs and SQs are actually separate. However, Berkeley rather profoundly argues that, this requires an abstraction that we've never experienced. We can never actually encounter this power that PQs have. Therefore, we can't picture PQs and SQs to be different. However, Berkeley is conflating, or I suppose my interpretation of Berkeley is conflating picturing with conceiving. I can conceive the difference between a 1000-sided shape and a 999-sided shape without picturing it, because obviously it's just one less side. So therefore, I'd have to argue that Berkeley's argument for inseparability of PQs and SQs actually fails. Because even though I can't picture them, I can conceive them differently. And conception, as some philosophers argue, is actually more important than what we can picture. So therefore, in my eyes, Berkeley's argument fails. Now on to the master argument. This is Berkeley's most famous argument, and if you've watched any YouTube videos on this, read any of the literature, or have just read Berkeley or just know a bit about Berkeley, this is the argument that you've clicked on for. So essentially, Berkeley challenges the reader to picture a tree which exists independently of any mind. In doing so, the tree is being conceived by you, therefore the tree is not mind independent at all, but actually dependent on a mind, which Berkeley then jumps and says, this is proof of my idealism. However, Russell, a later 20th century philosopher, actually provides a very strong argument against this. Russell argues it is an error which Berkeley has committed in his master argument. He claims that he's confused the mental act of conceiving a thing with the actual thing itself being conceived. So if we're to picture this, and I'll do some drawings on screen to try and illustrate this, but essentially Berkeley is picturing the tree, whereas the actual tree itself is still mind independent. What's mind dependent is the picture of the tree. So therefore, it is true that the idea of the tree must be in my mind, but it doesn't follow that what my idea is about, the tree itself, must be in my mind. So Russell would argue, if you try and imagine the tree outside of your mind, unfortunately it's been caught in your mind. So basically, Berkeley set up a philosophical trap which you can't get out of through his master argument. Nevertheless, I don't actually think Berkeley's most famous argument, the master argument, is actually his most strongest and convincing argument for idealism. However, it illustrates a deeper point about how ideas cannot be like objects. Now, ideas cannot be like objects. On the surface, it's a pretty weird argument. Essentially saying here is there's two categories here. You've got ideas and you've got objects. Ideas are fleeting, they're ever changing. They're first person subjective qualia. However, matter by definition lacks this. Matter, if it exists, Berkeley says, must be constant. This object isn't changing like my ideas are. This object too also lacks qualia. There's no first person subjective irreducible experience within this object like there is in my own consciousness or my ideas. Therefore, invoking Leibniz's law, which if you don't know Leibniz's law, it essentially says if you've got two things, x and y, x has the property of f, y does not have the property of f, therefore x cannot be y. So for example, I have brown hair, my friend has blonde hair, therefore we can't be the same person. The same thing cannot have two different properties at the same time. I could easily dye my hair, but obviously then there'd be different properties, which makes me not him. But applying this reasoning to Berkeley's two categories of ideas and objects, we can then conclude that ideas cannot be like objects. Therefore, we can't use our ideas to understand matter. So from this argument, it can be said that idealism is far more plausible than indirect realism or direct realism, or any philosophical theory which advocates for a mind-independent, objective world which actually exists other than just minds and ideas. From this point, I'm going to kind of move away from Berkeley's arguments for a moment and go to my own, because critics of Berkeley would famously point out that, this shows that ideas don't resemble objects, but it doesn't prove that objects don't exist, which is a fair argument on the surface. However, if we only have access to our ideas, you can't refute the fact that we have access to ideas, and we use these ideas to verify our experience, this means that we cannot use our ideas conclusively to verify the existence of an external world. This is because if it cannot be understood because they're not similar, then what's the point? It's like the indirect realist saying it resembles it. Well, do you have any justification to believe that? Not particularly. Therefore, it makes more sense to say, well, if we can't intelligibly understand something, we might as well cut it off. And that's what Berkeley was doing. He's trying to refute skepticism, and he does that successfully by eliminating the veil of perception between object and idea and just believing in the idea. He's refuted skepticism, and that's what I've shown there. So I would argue that argument that Berkeley's provided and my later addition to it has made idealism pretty strong. However, Berkeley's main problem is God. Now, Berkeley does what most philosophers do, like Descartes and others. When his system starts creaking and needs proof, he brings in God. This is because some would argue Berkeley's appeal to God is ultimately motivated by his religious commitments rather than philosophical necessity. Now, in Berkeley's defense, he does have pretty good reasons for believing in God. Most notably, God is the IBE for the coherence of Berkeley's experiences. Why does the apple rot when I put it in the drawer and leave it? Because God is the supermind. Berkeley argues as well, we have an understanding and a notion of God through our own mind. However, we don't have a notion nor have we ever experienced matter. Berkeley also argues this is a better way to understand causation through volition. For example, my mind can imagine a beach without the beach actually being in front of me. Berkeley also argues we have no other experience of causation. Therefore, as much as I disagree and think Berkeley's incorrect, he does have some fairly good reasons to believe in God, and the claim that
he only liked him because he was a bishop, and that's why he included it,
was pretty weak, considering the fact that Berkeley created his philosophy probably, I think it was close to 30 years before he was a bishop, and so when people say he only liked him because he he was a bishop, they're just incorrect. And they're lacking nuance and understanding to Berkeley's genius, I would argue. However, Berkeley's God is actually inconsistent, I would argue, with the Abrahamic religions. So, well, of course, to Berkeley, Christianity is where it applies. Because shockingly, Berkeley was not a Jew or a Muslim. I know, crazy. So Berkeley's God, if it exists, causes all experience within us. Pain is an experience. Therefore, Berkeley's God must cause pain. However, to cause pain, you must understand it. You can't cause something which you don't understand. So therefore, God must know pain. However, if God experiences pain, then how can God be all-powerful and all-good? Because it limits his power, and pain is, some would argue, theologically speaking, that pain is not good. It's the opposite of goodness. Therefore, Berkeley's God is inconsistent with the religion that he claims. Now, there's two rebuttals to this, and I would argue both defeat them. The first is Berkeley could just abandon Christianity. That's plausible and would refute the claim. And Berkeley's God would function more like a fantastic supercomputer more than this cosmic deity in the traditional Abrahamic religions. That's a plausible way to refute this claim. However, I would argue more predominantly a better way to refute this claim would be to draw the distinction between experience and conception. Like before, I can conceive the difference between a 1,000-sided shape and a 999-sided shape without experiencing them. Therefore, God can conceive pain without experiencing it, and that refutes the objections that limit his omnibenevolence and omnipotency. Even so, I think God is introduced as a metaphysical posit to save idealism rather than philosophical necessity. Most notably, Berkeley argues we have a notion of God. Now, this notion of God, and when I reread the dialogues and the principles of human knowledge for this video and other works of Berkeley, it's not very well explained, and it's very vague. And you notice this with a lot of philosophers, where they start to make really good points, you're following along, and then they introduce a really vague idea, and it's like, well, that doesn't fit and it doesn't make sense. So I think he's kind of introduced it to just put it in and go,
please guys, it works.
I don't think the notion for God works. And this is because Berkeley is a concept empiricist. That basically means that he's got concepts in his mind which are gained through experience. And being a concept empiricist, that means that he must experience God's mind to derive that concept and have that concept. The issue with that is I believe his argument ideas cannot be like matter actually proves too much. In the sense of, all we can have is our ideas. So if all we can have is ideas and our direct experience of ideas, that means we can't have experience of other minds. In this sense, Berkeley's appeal to God fails, and as God connects our mind to everybody else's mind, so does Berkeley's appeal to other minds. This means that Berkeley reduces to solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical theory that only your mind can exist, and that other minds don't exist. However, I would argue, and as Wittgenstein in the Philosophical Investigations would argue, solipsism is a logically consistent and possible philosophical theory, however it is not tenable. That basically means that even though it is logically possible, in that there's no contradiction in conceiving it, it's not tenable in the sense of, it just doesn't work. It's just not plausible. Wittgenstein does this through the private language argument. So Wittgenstein argues that words only have meaning if they can be corrected and used correctly. So for example, the word dog, D-O-G, refers to actual dogs. So the word matches the concept. These rules can only be learnt through people correcting other people in their usage. So for example, when you're a child and you're in a nursery or whatnot, and they're holding a picture of a dog and you say the word cat, the teacher's going to correct you. They're going to say, no, that's not a cat. This is a cat. This is a dog. This can only happen because both student and teacher have access to the world. Therefore, these words can only have meaning if they are accessed by other people. This means that when we're speaking English or whatever language, our language is public in that it can be corrected. Therefore, public language has meaning. However, private language, which if solipsism and how Berkeley's reduced to solipsism is true, cannot have meaning, because that would mean that Berkeley's words, when he's saying hello, could be otherwise. It could be
Or it could be
But you know what I mean? Because they are privately accessed, there's no one to mediate or correct his usage, therefore it's meaningless. So although solipsism is logically possible, it's not tenable. However, I would argue, although Wittgenstein's argument can be used against Berkeley, I would actually argue that it strengthens his position significantly. This is because Berkeley's language would be checked. This is because he had experience of other people in his quote-unquote idea world. Therefore, Wittgenstein actually strengthens this radical form of idealism, which I'm not sure the historical Berkeley would have actually agreed to, considering his appeal to God. But if we're trying to ground idealism in the 21st century with our current philosophical understanding, I think it's a pretty strong argument to get out of solipsism. However, the counter-reply to this is pretty obvious. You could say Berkeley preserves the theatre of language, let's say, in that, in his ideal world, dream state, hallucination, his, whatever you want to call it, that's preserved. But the normativity of language, which obviously refers to language used in the actual mind-independent world, is not preserved. However, that argument's question-begging. It assumes the existence of a mind-independent world from the point. However, Berkeley's ideas cannot be like material objects argument refutes the fact that there is a mind-independent world. So therefore, I would argue, it's question-begging. They're assuming a premise from the start of the argument. So therefore, I believe there's no controversy in saying at this point that there perhaps could be no more to reality than the theatre of language, the world of ideas. Therefore, what I would argue is, when Berkeley's idealism is pushed within the realms of 21st century understanding and philosophical knowledge, what's left is ideas and other minds. We don't need God, at least I would argue from what I've argued thus far. God is not a philosophical necessity. I can understand why Berkeley put him in, but he's not a philosophical necessity for idealism to be a strong position. So, I would argue idealism is an extremely intellectually plausible epistemological account of perception. However, I must, for the sake of intellectual clarity, must state that I don't think the historical Berkeley would have agreed with me. Now, to conclude, let's go back to the guy at the beginning that may or may have not been on drugs or needs to be sectioned. Hopefully after this video, you've gained an intellectual respect for idealism. I'm not saying that my arguments are infallible and completely true, otherwise I'd be extremely egotistical and be stepping out of any realms of, intellectual respect, I suppose. Hopefully after this video, even if you reject idealism and still remain a realist, you can at least respect and appreciate Berkeley's mission. And I hope now his position is more serious than it seemed at the start. But if you want my opinion on idealism from the perspective of the anecdote at the start, yeah, definitely run away. I don't think he's an idealist, I just think he's deranged.